It was 1949, and Chicago was doing what Chicago always does in November, making you feel like the cold was personal. 2 years since the Bloody Leaf case. 2 years since I walked out of that warehouse on Wabash and watched them put Johnny Carell in a car headed for Stateville. 12 years. The judge called it justice. I called it paperwork. The city moved on, the way cities do, indifferent as weather. Me, I was still on the force. Barely. 40 years in, and I was the kind of detective they keep around because nobody wants to do the paperwork to retire you. Pryor handled the legwork now. I handled the thinking. On good days, my hands shook more than they used to. The charcoal wool coat Eleanor gave me still hung on the peg by my desk, still smelled faintly of her if the room was cold enough. She was still at her sister's house. We still called it temporary. I still believed it some mornings. November in Chicago. Tired city, tired detective, same arrangement as always. The call came in at 6:30 in the morning. I was already awake. Sleep and I had a professional disagreement that went back years. Dispatch said a man named Harold Voss had been... The door had been bolted from the inside. The first officer, keen, young, still surprised by death, told me they'd had to get the landlord to come down with a skeleton key for the rear service door. No forced entry anywhere. Windows latched. Harold Voss was slumped at his workbench like a man who'd fallen asleep over his work, which men do, except the stillness was the wrong kind of still. He was maybe 60, slight, with the careful hands of somebody who spent his life touching small things. A magnifying loupe was still hanging from a cord around his neck. On the bench in front of him, a clock movement lay half disassembled, tiny gears arranged in a row. The lamp above was still burning, throwing a small warm circle of light over everything. I stood in the doorway for a moment and just looked. Keene said his lieutenant thought it was a heart attack, old man. Alone. These things happen. I said, yes, they do. I didn't say what else I was thinking. The shop smelled of machine oil and sawdust and the faint mineral sharpness of metal on metal. I walked in slowly, hands in my pockets, and I started looking at the walls. There were 11 clocks in that shop. I counted them twice because the first count seemed wrong, and I have a habit of not trusting things that seem too neat. Wall clocks, mantel clocks, one tall case clock in the corner that looked older than the building. They were hung and positioned at different heights, different styles, a lifetime of accumulation. What they had in common was this: every single one of them had stopped, not wound down gradually, not staggered across different times the way clocks do when they run out at different rates. Every face in that room read 3:17. 11 clocks. One moment. I stood in the middle of the shop and turned slowly, looking at each one. I didn't say it out loud. Keene was watching me, and I didn't want to give him anything to repeat back at the station. I just noted it, the way you note a name that comes up twice in different contexts. You don't know what it means yet, but you file it somewhere you can find it again. 3:17 a.m. Harold Voss, slumped at his bench. 11 clocks, not one of them ticking. I put my hands in my pockets to keep them still, and I kept looking. The medical examiner was a man named Feldstein who had the permanent look of someone running slightly late. He confirmed cardiac arrest. No signs of external violence, no bruising, no ligature marks, nothing on the skin that suggested a struggle. Natural causes, pending tox. I asked him to run the tox screen anyway. He looked at me over his glasses the way doctors look at detectives who are wasting their time. I said I understood he was busy. I said I was asking anyway. He said the department didn't fund speculative lab work on natural deaths. I said Harold Voss was found alone in a locked room with 11 stop clocks all reading the same time, and that I'd sleep better with a full panel. He said that wasn't a medical argument. I said he was right, it wasn't. I said do it anyway. He said he'd put in the request, which meant he'd do it eventually, which meant I'd be waiting. That was fine. I'd waited before. The city ran on waiting for warrants, waiting for witnesses to stop lying, waiting for labs that had 12 cases ahead of yours. I thanked Feldstein, which surprised him. Then I went back to the shop to look at the ledgers. The shop's papers were kept in a wooden cabinet behind the counter, organized the way only a careful man organizes things, by year, by client, by job type. Voss had been meticulous. I went through 2 years of ledgers and found what I was looking for on the third pass. 2 names listed as apprentices, Eddie Marsh, who'd been working there about 14 months, and a man named Corbin, first name Raymond, who'd logged his last day of work 8 days before Voss died. No forwarding address in the records, no note about why he'd left, just the entry stopping. One day present, the next day absent, and then nothing but Eddie Marsh's name in the columns. I photographed the pages with the department camera Pryor had lent me, and I made notes on the back of a receipt I found near the door. The shop was quiet. The clocks were still stopped. I had forensics coming at noon. I locked the rear service door behind me, stood in the rain on Clark Street for a moment, and thought about a man who'd spent 20 years fixing things that other people let run down. Then I went to find the neighbors. The apartment above the shop belonged to a woman named Mrs. Heller, who had been on Clark Street so long she remembered when the building had been a tailor's. She was in her late 70s, sharp-eyed, and she made coffee before I'd finished introducing myself, which I took as a good sign. She said Harold was a quiet man, kept regular hours, never played a radio past 9. She said she'd been sorry to hear about it, said it the way people say things they mean. Then I asked about the night before his body was found and the night before that. She thought about it carefully, which I respected. She said 2 nights before, that would be Thursday, she'd heard footsteps on the stairs below her, not from Harold's apartment, but from the shop itself. She said it was just past 2 in the morning because the church on the corner had chimed twice and she'd checked her own clock, being a light sleeper. She said the footsteps were careful, not hurrying, not Voss's shuffle, which she knew the sound of after years, someone else's walk, someone who didn't want to be heard, which meant they knew someone might be listening. I drank the coffee. It was good coffee. I asked if she'd seen anyone. She hadn't seen anyone. She'd stayed in bed, the way sensible people do when they hear sounds they can't explain. I thanked her and went looking for Eddie Marsh. It took half the day. He wasn't at any address the shop records had for him. I tried 3 rooming houses before a woman at a laundry on Fullerton told me he'd taken work at a diner 2 blocks north. I found him there in the afternoon lull, bussing tables, a boy of maybe 20 with the thin, careful movements of someone who'd been frightened recently and hadn't stopped being frightened yet. I showed my badge, and his face did something complicated. I told him I just wanted to talk. He said he was working. I said I'd wait. He brought me coffee I didn't need and sat across from me in a corner booth, and he looked everywhere in that diner except at my face. His hands were restless on the table. I knew the feeling. I told him I wasn't there to make trouble for him. I told him his former employer was dead, and I was trying to understand why. He looked at the table. He said he didn't know anything. I said that was fine, and I waited. And eventually he started talking the way people do when the silence gets heavier than what they're carrying. Eddie Marsh talked in the way scared people talk, circling around things, doubling back, correcting himself, but what came out was useful. He said Voss had borrowed money about a year ago, a significant sum, to replace equipment. A lathe had given out, and there were 2 others failing. He'd gone to a private lender named Sal Ruiz, who operated out of a tobacco shop on Wacker. The loan had terms Voss hadn't fully understood when he signed, and when he'd fallen behind on payments, Ruiz had come to him with a new arrangement: sign the shop over as collateral, restructure the debt, keep operating, but under Ruiz's ownership on paper. Voss had refused, flat out apparently, without much discussion. Eddie said Voss told him the shop was the only thing left of his that was still his, and he wasn't signing it to anybody. Eddie said Ruiz had come to the shop twice after that. The second time there had been raised voices in the back room, and Eddie had made himself very busy at the front counter. I asked what Ruiz looked like. Eddie said smooth, well-dressed, like someone who'd learned to look like money without ever being nervous about it. I wrote down the name and put my pen away. Sal Ruiz came into the interview room at the precinct like a man arriving at a business lunch. Dark suit, good fabric, shoes that had seen a recent polish. He had the kind of stillness that comes either from innocence or from practice, and in my experience, the 2 look identical until they don't. I laid out what I had: the loan, the collateral dispute, the 2 visits to the shop. He acknowledged all of it without hesitation, which told me he'd already decided what his story was going to be. He said it was a business arrangement that hadn't worked out. He said he was sorry about Voss, genuinely, said it with the right amount of feeling. He said he'd been at a poker game the night Voss died, and the night before that, and he had 6 men who'd put him there. I said 6 men was a lot of witnesses. He said he had a lot of friends. He said it pleasantly. He sat in that chair like a man who knew exactly how long he was going to be there and had made his peace with it. I let him go. I didn't have enough yet, but I watched him walk out, and I thought, there's a man who uses other people the way a clockmaker uses tools, carefully, at a distance, letting the mechanism do the work. Raymond Corbin was living in a rooming house on the south side, off Cottage Grove, the kind of place where the landlady doesn't ask questions because the rent comes in cash and cash has its own etiquette. The room was on the 2nd floor. Corbin answered the door in his undershirt, a cigarette already burning, and when he saw the badge, his eyes did what eyes do when someone's been waiting for a knock and isn't sure which knock this is. He let me in. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and something underneath it. Anxiety, maybe, or just the particular staleness of a man who hasn't opened a window in a week. He sat on the edge of the bed. I took the chair by the small table. There was a glass ashtray on the table with 4 dead cigarettes in it, and he lit a 5th before I'd finished sitting down. I said I was looking into Harold Voss's death. He said he'd heard. I said I wanted to know why he'd left. He said Voss had become difficult to work for. I asked what that meant. He said Voss was distracted, talking to himself, not focused on the work. I said that was vague. He said it was what he had. His right leg was bouncing. The cigarette was already half gone. I let the silence run. Corbin smoked through it. Then I asked about the pocket watch. I'd seen it mentioned in a margin note in Voss's ledger. A single notation, no context, just the words, T's watch, wound. I hadn't known what it meant yet, but I'd written it down. When I said pocket watch, something shifted in Corbin's expression. Not guilt exactly. Something more like relief at a subject that wasn't the subject he was most afraid of. He said Voss carried a pocket watch that wasn't a customer's piece and wasn't his own. A silver case, Hamilton movement, initialed on the back. He said Voss wound it every morning first thing before he touched any other work. He said Voss sometimes held it in his palm and just looked at it. He said it got worse in the last months, more frequent. Sometimes Voss would stop mid-task and wind the watch and sit very still. Corbin said he didn't know whose it was. I said I thought he might be telling the truth about that part. I asked if Voss ever talked about the watch. Corbin said once, just once, Voss had said, he can't know it stopped. I wrote that down. He can't know it stopped. I looked at it on the page for a moment before I asked my next question. I found the answer to that question in Voss's apartment, which was on the 3rd floor of the same building as the shop. The landlord let me in that evening. It was a careful, quiet apartment, everything in its place, a habit of order. On the mantelpiece above a small gas fire there was a photograph in a wooden frame. 2 young men, one of them clearly Harold Voss at maybe 30, the other one similar enough to be a brother, smiling in an army uniform, written in pencil on the back of the frame, Thomas, Anzio, 1944. There was a small dish beside the photograph, and in the dish a silver pocket watch, Hamilton movement, initialed TV on the back. I wound it gently, the way Voss must have done. It ticked. I set it back in the dish. Thomas Voss had died at Anzio 5 years ago, and Harold had been winding his watch ever since, keeping it alive by proxy, refusing to let it run down to nothing, keeping time for a man who no longer needed time kept. I stood in that apartment for a while. The gas fire ticked. Outside, Clark Street moved in the rain, indifferent. Some grief doesn't ask to be understood. It just asks to be left alone to do its work. The talk screen came back 4 days later, which was faster than I'd expected, which meant Feldstein had actually put it in promptly, which meant he'd been less certain than he'd let on. The results showed elevated digitalis glycoside levels, not dramatically elevated, just enough accumulated. Cardiac glycoside poisoning presents exactly like a heart attack in a man of Voss's age with his medical history. Without knowing to look for it, most labs wouldn't flag it. I'd known to look because I'd stood in that room with the stopped clocks and decided the easy answer wasn't the right one. I went back to Sal Ruiz. I went deeper this time. Corporate filings, shell companies, anything with his name adjacent to it. Pryor ran it from the office. What came back was a holding company with a pharmacy subsidiary on the west side, and attached to that subsidiary, a chemist named Werner who had 2 debts to Ruiz, totaling more money than a chemist makes in 3 years. Digitalis is a pharmaceutical compound. Werner had access to concentrated preparations. I pulled Werner's financials and found 2 cash payments over the previous 6 weeks, amounts that didn't match his income. The mechanism was coming into view. Now I needed the man who'd operated it. The reconstruction took another 2 days and a great deal of patience. What I arrived at was this. Ruiz had needed Voss removed without violence, without evidence, without anything that pointed back to a business dispute about a loan. Corbin had been the instrument. He'd worked in that shop for months, had access to the coffee, the kettle, the small domestic rhythms of a man who kept regular habits. A careful sublethal dose of digitalis glycoside administered over 2 weeks in Voss's coffee would accumulate gradually in a man of 60 with a history of mild cardiac irregularity. No marks, no struggle, just a heart that finally stopped during the night, alone in a locked shop, looking like every other story about old men and overwork. Corbin had quit, been told to quit, 8 days before the end, to put distance between himself and what was coming. He would have been told to leave no trace. He'd done the work carefully. I thought about Voss, sitting at his bench through those 2 weeks, winding Thomas's watch in the mornings, fixing the small broken things people brought him, not knowing that someone was quietly, methodically stopping him, the way you stop a clock, deliberately, one small interference at a time. The clocks were the last piece. I'd known Corbin had set them. It had to be him. He was the only one with a key to the rear door and the knowledge of the shop's layout, but I needed to understand why. I sat with it for a day before it resolved. Corbin had come back that night, after Voss was gone, and set every clock in the shop to 3:17, not because it meant anything, because it looked like it meant something. A locked room, a dead man, 11 clocks stopped at the same moment. It had all the appearance of something inexplicable, something that would make a first officer write natural causes and move on, something that would make an examiner not look for a compound he had no reason to look for. Misdirection, not for the supernatural. Corbin wasn't a theatrical man. Nothing in his background suggested that kind of thinking. Just noise. Noise designed to stall, to confuse, to make the investigation feel strange enough that the obvious questions wouldn't get asked. It had almost worked. It would have worked if Voss hadn't been the kind of man whose death deserved more than almost. I thought about that, and then I went to find Corbin. I went back to the rooming house on Cottage Grove. Corbin was there. He opened the door and looked at me, and I could see in his face that he'd been waiting for this, that the waiting had been worse than whatever came next. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't put my hand on my weapon. I sat in the same chair by the table, and I told him what I knew, piece by piece, in order. Werner and the pharmaceutical payments, the 2 cash transfers, the digitalist levels in the talk screen, Mrs. Heller and the footsteps at 2 in the morning, the clocks. I laid it out the way you lay out a clock movement on a bench, every component in its place, every connection made visible. Corbin smoked. He lit cigarettes and let them burn down without taking a drag. His leg had stopped bouncing. When people stop their nervous movements, in my experience, it means they've made a decision. The cigarette burned down to his fingers, and he didn't move it. Then he said, "I didn't know about the watch." I said, "What watch?" He said, "The brother's watch." He said Voss talked about Thomas sometimes while they worked. He said he hadn't known that part. His voice broke on it, just slightly. I waited. Then I put a statement for him on the table between us. Corbin signed the statement in the presence of 2 witnesses and Pryor, who'd come down from the precinct when I'd called it in. Ruiz was arrested that same evening at his club on Michigan Avenue, a place with leather chairs and a bar that stocked things you couldn't get during the war and apparently hadn't stopped serving afterward. He was with two other men when we came in, and the way he looked up when he saw me told me he'd known this was coming too. Some people accept the end of a game with more dignity than they played the game. Ruiz was one of those. He stood up, straightened his jacket, let Pryor put the cuffs on without a word. He looked at me while it happened, steady, assessing, already calculating, not angry, not afraid, just recalibrating, the kind of man who thinks in contingencies. He didn't say anything until we were outside, and then he said only, "I want my attorney." I said that was his right. He said he knew it was. Pryor put him in the car. I stood on Michigan Avenue in the cold and watched the car pull away, and I thought about Harold Voss at his bench winding a dead man's watch, and I thought about what a thing it is to be reduced to a problem someone else needed to solve. The report took the better part of 2 days to write properly. I've always believed a case report should tell the story in the right order, not the order you learned it, but the order it happened, so that whoever reads it years from now can follow the logic without needing to have stood in that room. I wrote about Voss and his shop and his ledgers. I wrote about the loan and Ruiz and Werner and the pharmaceutical chain. I wrote about Corbin and the coffee and the 2 weeks of careful, murderous patience. I wrote about the clocks and what they were intended to accomplish. What I didn't write about was the pocket watch on the mantelpiece. That belonged to Voss and Thomas and whatever conversation they'd been having across the silence since 1944, and it wasn't evidence of anything except love, which doesn't belong in a case report. I filed everything with the DA's office, shook hands with the assistant DA who'd be taking it to trial, collected my notes from the shop one last time, and drove home through November rain. The coat was damp by the time I got upstairs. I hung it on the peg. I sat down. I didn't call Eleanor. I should have. I thought about it for a long time. Then I poured 2 fingers of rye and let the city be quiet for an hour. I went back to the shop one more time, 3 days after filing, because I'd left a notebook in the drawer behind the counter and forensics had cleared the scene. The landlord had a new padlock on the front door, but had left the rear unlocked for me. He'd been decent throughout. A man named Potowski, who'd said Voss had been a good tenant for 18 years and never given him a day's trouble. I let myself in through the back. The forensics team had been thorough, which meant everything was slightly out of place. Drawers opened and closed, surfaces dusted and wiped, the careful order of the shop disrupted by the organized disorder of an investigation. The clocks had all been reset to the correct time. Someone on the forensics team, or maybe Potowski, had wound them and set them running. They ticked in the empty shop, 11 of them slightly out of sync with each other, creating that layered sound that clockmakers live in and the rest of us only notice when it stops. I found my notebook in the second drawer, exactly where I'd left it. I tucked it in my coat pocket. I looked around the shop one last time, the way you look at a place you won't return to. Then I was about to leave. I glanced at the clocks one last time before I reached the rear door. Old habit. All 11 were running, showing different times, ticking in their overlapping rhythms, except one. The smallest one on the far wall low down, a mantelpiece Voss must have used as a shelf clock. Black wooden case, white enamel face, worn gilt numbers. It read 3:17, not running, stopped cold. I walked over. I wound the key carefully, the way I'd watched Voss's hands described. It ticked 3 times. Then it stopped at 3:17. I set it back on the shelf. I didn't touch it again. I walked out. I told myself it was a mechanical fault, a spring worn through, a pivot fatigued, the particular failure mode of an old clock nobody had serviced in weeks. Corbin set those clocks. I proved it. I know exactly what happened in that room. But I wound that clock myself, and it stopped at 3:17. Some cases close clean, some leave a door open just a crack. I never went back to that shop, but some nights when the city goes quiet and my hands won't stop shaking, I think about Thomas Voss, died at Anzio in 1944, and his brother winding that pocket watch every morning like a prayer, and that clock on the shelf still stopped at 3:17. I never did figure out if the dead leave or if they just get quieter.